Welcome. Welcome everybody to our first Wagner Society of Northern California presentation of the year. And this one is a Zoom webinar. Today our guest is Professor Chris Walton, who is coming to us from Switzerland, where he teaches at the Bern University of the Arts. And he has just published a comprehensive book on Wagner the conductor, going into his career as a conductor and how that career went on to inform the way Wagner the composer wrote his music. And he was a very prolific writer. We all know that. He has a lot of prose works and also then his scholarly works where he talks about all of these things. I have not read them all. In fact, I've not read very many of them. But I would like to turn the program over to our speaker today, Professor Walton, and I'm going to make myself go away.
Me too.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Good evening from Switzerland and good afternoon in California. I hope you can all hear me well. Otherwise, I'm sure you'll let me know. I'd like to start by thanking Terry and the committee of your society for asking me to speak today. I would, of course, much rather be over there in person, not least since I've got a good friend in your part of the world who keeps asking me across, sadly to no avail. But as much as I like traveling, it's better for the environment if we do this online. I believe the Met in New York is broadcasting Fedora today. And while it's the first time I've ever been in competition with a hat, I can't blame anyone for tuning in there and not here. So a double thanks go to all of you who are present, and I hope I'll be able to provide some enlightenment tonight and this afternoon, and that you'll go away with a few new insights, or at the very least, ask me some awkward questions at the end of my talk. That would be nice. As you have already heard, I'm going to talk to you about Richard Wagner, the conductor. That might in itself seem a bit strange because the last people who actually heard or saw him conduct died some 90 years ago. Since Thomas Edison invented the phonograph in about 1877, and Edward Muybridge invented the moving image in 1878-79, it would in theory have been possible for Wagner to record something for either both or just one of them. Of course he didn't, though I'm sure it could make a great topic for a thriller of the alternative history variety, hunting down a lost Wagner recording instead of the Holy Grail or something. Where's Dan Brown when you need him? Our problems are compounded by the fact that we have almost no marked up scores or parts from Wagner's performances that could provide us with concrete information about how he conducted. Apart from the fact that he kept going on the run without his library, he also preferred to rehearse and perform the major works of the repertoire from memory, without a score, as astonishing as that sounds. He only ever had one real conducting student, Hans von Bülow, who had lessons with him also only very briefly in Zurich in 1850. And in fact, Wagner conducted remarkably rarely after he ceased his collaboration with the Zurich Orchestra in 1855. He went on the odd concert tours, conducted the odd performance of his operas here and there, but not much else. He never even conducted a world premiere of any of his operas after Tannhäuser. So it's almost like fate is conspiring to prevent us from knowing what Wagner actually did on the podium. We do have some contemporary accounts of how Wagner conducted. I'll quote a couple later. And as I'll also explain tonight, Wagner himself became somewhat obsessed by the problem of how to get people to perform his music the way he wanted it performed, especially after his death. He developed several strategies to try and establish a performing tradition for his works. One of the most important of these was to write essays about how people should conduct. As you've just heard from Terry, during the pandemic, I brought out a new translation of Wagner's most important writings on conducting. These essays, heavily annotated by me, take up half the book. The other half is a series of my own essays on the topic of Wagner and conducting. It's remarkably cheap. You can order it with a 30% discount using a code I can pass on to you. And since I don't get any royalties, you don't need to worry about funding any dissolute lifestyle on my part. And so I don't feel too embarrassed about plugging the book here. It was funded through a research project at the Bern University of the Arts and Applied Sciences, which is also why you'll now be seeing the name of my institution at the bottom of my PowerPoint slides. Ta-da! Enough of that. Because Wagner used his essays to explain his art of conducting, I'll be talking quite a lot about them here, their background and what he says in them, before I go on to discuss more directly musical matters. And I do have a few music clips for you at the end, sadly, obviously not of Wagner himself, but of more or less the next best things, I would argue. If I had to name a date for the emergence of the Austro-German conducting tradition that's remained of vital significance in the music world right up to this day in the work of men such as Christian Thielemann, it would have to be late 1869, when the first installment of Richard Wagner's essay Über das Dirigieren on conducting appeared in the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik. Further installments continued over the ensuing weeks, up to and including the 21st of January 1870. Wagner's contributions in each case featured on the front page, except for issue 1 on the 1st of January 1870, which began with an article by Ludwig Nohl about the forthcoming Beethoven centenary. Along with its sister article by Wagner on performing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, published 3 years later, Über das Dirigieren proved to be the most influential text ever written on the art of conducting. I haven't found a single book of significance on conducting from either the late 19th or the 20th centuries that doesn't draw on this essay, sometimes to the point of plagiarism. The impact of Wagner's essay wasn't confined to the German-speaking world. For within 25 years of its initial publication, Über das Dirigieren had been translated 1.5 times into French and twice into English. Of course, the French have to do things differently. In fact, the first French translation of it was by Wagner's own step-brother-in-law, Guy de Charnassé, though Guy quite obviously couldn't stand Richard, and it's a bit of a hatchet job. Think, oh, I don't know, Princes Harry and William without the New Age stuff. Although he published Über das Dirigieren only in late 1869 and early 1870, it seems clear from various documentary sources that Wagner had been planning it since at least 1856. When he finally did get around to committing his ideas on conducting to paper, I believe that he did so in reaction to someone else, and I believe that this is confirmed by a careful reading of the first page of his essay. Wagner writes, and in these cases I will always give you an English translation of the German when the German is important. He writes, "My assessment of things is addressed to musicians and singers because they alone can sense properly whether they are being conducted either well or badly. I do not intend to construct any system here." Now, when Wagner insists he's not going to do something, it's often, well, almost always, an inferred criticism of someone else who has just done that. This last sentence could thus be interpreted as a riposte to some unnamed party who had indeed endeavored to construct a system of conducting. We have a prime candidate for this, Hector Berlioz, whose Le Chef d'Orchestre was published at roughly the same time that Wagner seems to have begun planning his own article. Berlioz's essay on conducting is indeed systematic, for he scrupulously depicts, for example, the different patterns utilized when beating time. Here we have them. There's even reason to believe that Wagner saw the publication of Berlioz's essay as a personal affront. In the spring of 1855, both Wagner and Berlioz were engaged to conduct in London. Without going into the details here, Berlioz was a hit, Wagner was a flop. Though, of course, in Mein Leben he describes it the opposite way around. What's more, it was at this time that Alfred Novello from the famous English publishing company commissioned Berlioz to write his conducting essay. It was accordingly published in late 1855 as a supplement to the revised edition of his treatise on orchestration. Translations into English by Novello's own sister and into German appeared the following year. The English edition was even serialized by the Musical Times, Novello's house journal, in 1856. Wagner too had mixed with the Novellos in London. He had conducted Novello's other sister, the soprano Clara, in one of his concerts. But it was Berlioz whom Novello asked to write an essay about conducting, not Wagner. Despite the friendly correspondence between Wagner and Berlioz in these years, Wagner tended neither to forget nor to forgive such matters. So while Berlioz is never mentioned by name in Über das Dirigieren, it's possible that he was actually the catalyst for it, and the fact that he's not mentioned could in fact be intentional and significant. We can't know, of course. Since Berlioz died in March 1869, this might even have emboldened Wagner to commit his essay to paper at last. After all, there was no danger that Berlioz would ever be able to write a reply to it in turn. Incidentally, System, system, is a word that usually, though not always, has negative connotations in Wagner as something dry and abstract, and it even merges with his anti-Semitism, as we can see here. He writes about this new Jewish system that was based on this characteristic of Mendelssohn's music. Incidentally, there's a striking correlation here with the later use of the word by the Nazis to describe the Weimar Republic, again, of course, with anti-Semitic connotations. But for reasons of time, I simply mention it here and refer you to Victor Klemperer's excellent discussion of the word in his book LTI. It's typical of Wagner that much of his essay on conducting seems to have been written in reaction to the activities of men he disliked, and for all kinds of reasons. While Berlioz remains unmentioned, Wagner is unable to refrain from naming other leading conductors of his time whose practices he regarded as being in opposition to his own. Most notably Karl Reisiger, his former colleague and conducting rival in Dresden, and of course Felix Mendelssohn, who hovers behind much of Wagner's essay. I'll return to him later. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, Wagner was highly active as a writer. He dictated his autobiography to Cosima and published numerous essays on all kinds of topics, about politics, about setting up a conservatory in Munich, and about presenting himself as Beethoven's musical heir, most notably in his essay Beethoven, published just a few months after Über das Dirigieren. I believe that none of these texts can be properly understood on its own because they together constitute a kind of meta-text. Reading Über das Dirigieren without reference to Wagner's other writings of the time is a bit like reading every other chapter in a novel. He occasionally makes this explicit. For example, early on in the second published installment of his essay, Wagner refers the reader specifically to his discussion of Mozart in his report on setting up a German conservatory in Munich, published in 1865. He writes, he requests those who seriously wish to follow my arguments to read the relevant passages there. Unless you read them, you don't really get what he's writing about. In some places, it pays to have a copy of Über das Dirigieren and Mein Leben open side by side. Wagner was working on both texts at roughly the same time, and it can happen that he puts half an argument in the one text, but the other half in the other text, presumably without intending to confuse the reader, as it will have all been complete in his own mind. In such cases, in my translation of the book, I add a footnote providing the complementary passage in the other book so that the reader doesn't have to go and look it up. These cases where Wagner's prodigious mind strayed freely from one text to another are probably also a side effect of his publishing Über das Dirigieren over 2 months. Although he'd planned it years before, it doesn't read as if he actually organized his thoughts properly in advance of each installment. This might also explain why time and again he gravitates back to his various pet hates, like a dog that can't stop going back to dig up the same old bone and gnawing on it. Wagner's vocabulary also reflects the circumstances of this essay's composition, for it's full of superlatives that suggest a desperation to convince his reader of his opinions. Wagner had always been fond of superlatives, of course, but a perusal of their use in his writings suggests that they reached a peak in the 1860s to early 1870s. I've counted nearly 100 superlatives in his conducting essay alone. Here are just a few of them. Some of them are absolutely wonderful. Allernichtssagendsten is one of my favorite ones, and entgegengesetztesten. Oh, it's ghastly. Those with an asterisk seem to occur nowhere else in Wagner's writings except in this essay, though I offer no ironclad guarantees. If you're wondering about my method for finding them, I did a full text search of all words ending in sten, ichsten, and so forth, naturally taking care not to count words such as bratschisten, which is presumably considered a superlative only by violists. Incidentally, this use of superlatives is not something with which Wagner seems to have infected Cosima, despite his dictating much of his prose to her. Her diaries use them far more sparingly. Wagner employs his superlatives to both positive and negative rhetorical effect. One of the most notable instances of a superlative with pejorative intent occurs when Wagner discusses Mendelssohn, a man so obviously gifted that not even Wagner felt able to denigrate his abilities in print. So instead, he praises him, though in a subclause using an implicitly double negative combined with a negatively connoted verb placed at the end of the clause. Mendelssohn, dem es doch wahrlich nicht an den ungewöhnlichen Kenntnissen Begabungen fehlte. There are so many odious passages such as this that while translating this text, I began having moral qualms about the task I had undertaken. I sympathized more and more with my predecessor, Robert Jacobs, who admitted the obviously anti-Semitic passages from the essay when he translated it some 50 years ago. But they are so interwoven with everything else, you can't excise them completely. And to leave them out would, to my mind, be tantamount to pretending they don't exist when they do. And that's a problem. You just have to look today at certain prominent politicians across the world, whether it's the USA, Europe, or the Middle East, to realize that anti-Semitism is inexplicably rearing its ugly head again. So we can't pretend it's not there. It's possible my decision was the wrong one, but I felt and feel it's better to tackle these issues head on while making clear how absurd and offensive they are. And in any case, Wagner's antipathies are useful signifiers for how much he actually respected certain contemporaries, or feared them, or was simply envious of them. Nor are these cases solely anti-Semitic. In Mein Leben, for example, Wagner praises all kinds of colleagues, only to add a nasty final comment about them each time, to say they were drunk, unmusical, or simply weird. If the use of superlatives is an instinctive action on Wagner's part, of which he was perhaps only vaguely aware himself, there is an aspect of his prose that's particularly noticeable and that seems quite intentional. But this too is a result of major insecurities on his part that I first want to explain. Time and again, Wagner refers negatively in this essay to the new conservatories of music and to those who study at them. The Leipzig Conservatory is a particular target of his, and he refers repeatedly to the elegant education that it offers its students. Elegant is a word that we find in his writings about Paris in the 1840s, but then barely at all until Über das Dirigieren. It then reappears in his ghastly pseudo-satire Eine Kapitulation after the Franco-Prussian War. Elegant was thus for Wagner a negative signifier of something either French or Jewish, possibly both, but in any case something that in his eyes wasn't German. And it also has a clearly anti-intellectual connotation, as in der elegante Kapellmeister neuesten Schlagers, the elegant Kapellmeister of the newest type. As I'm sure you're aware, Italy had had music conservatories for several centuries, but the idea of a place of musical learning was new north of the Alps, and the first of its kind in Germany was the Leipzig Conservatory, which Mendelssohn founded only in 1843. Wagner's antipathy towards these new institutions of musical learning was in part a result of his envy of Mendelssohn and towards all those who'd enjoyed a better education than him, and in part, inevitably, because of feelings of resentment that he hadn't set up a conservatory first. He did try to set one up in Munich in the 1860s, but he failed. As a result, all conservatories were now bad in his eyes. Wagner was also increasingly wary about the emerging field of musicology. The first Beethoven Gesamtausgabe had begun publication in 1862, but the scholars behind it had mostly been allied to Mendelssohn or Schumann. And those same scholars had also started publishing books and articles on Beethoven in the mid-1860s, editions of sketches, a work catalogue, and so on. Judging from his comments at the time, Wagner was afraid that these perceived enemies would employ their scholarship to determine the future reception of Beethoven's music, something that he felt was his responsibility alone. It's notable that from the late 1860s onwards, Wagner's writings place a particular emphasis on interpreting and understanding Beethoven. I believe this was in part a direct response to what he felt was a new, very real threat to his own self-appointed sovereignty of interpretation over Beethoven's music. Wagner's reaction to this increasing academicization of the music world in general, and of Beethoven reception in particular, is significant because it had a long-lasting impact on how later people wrote and thought about music. For one thing, Wagner now embarked on a strange balancing act. In Über das Dirigieren and its sister essay on Beethoven's Ninth, Wagner insists on maintaining a complete fidelity to the text, performing Beethoven as the master intended, which I believe is his acknowledgement of the recent trend towards scholarly textual rigor. But at the same time, Wagner insists no less on an organic approach to performance and interpretation, in which the ideal conductor, meaning him, Wagner, of course, could and should adapt and adjust both the tempo and even the musical text itself in order to fulfill the composer's true intentions. And those true intentions, of course, were to be divined by Wagner. Alterations that Wagner proposed to the orchestration of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, such as adding horns to the melody in the scherzo, were adopted by most other conductors for the next 80 years. I'll show you a couple of examples later with audio. When these later conductors felt they had to justify their amendments to Beethoven's text, they were able to do so by specific reference to Wagner's notions of textual fidelity. For example, when Mahler was attacked for retouching Beethoven's Ninth in Vienna in 1900, he had a handbill printed and distributed to explain that he was being utterly faithful to Beethoven's intentions, simply after the manner of Richard Wagner. Besides this squaring of the circle of textual fidelity and interpretive freedom, Wagner also responded to the challenge of burgeoning music scholarship in the language he chose to use to write about conducting. His opaque prose style is in itself a significant aspect of his desire to appear scholarly. While his early journalism from Paris and his forays into fiction of the early 1840s are couched in a lively, readable style, his prose becomes dense and convoluted when he embarks on his career as a music theorist in exile from 1849 onwards. By the time of Über das Dirigieren, there are passages in which it's sometimes difficult to determine what he is really saying, while his fondness for multiple negatives can sometimes come close to obscuring whether he is actually in favor of something or against it. This was, of course, problematical for me when I was trying to translate the stuff. But judging from my conversations with German-speaking Wagner scholars, it seems they all have the same problem. Wagner's insistence on stringing together negatives can actually offer a fascinating window onto his own insecurities and his need to create adversaries and barriers to be overcome in the, to him, inevitable ultimate victory of his art. But the closer you look, the more it becomes clear that double or triple negatives in Wagner signify not a negation of a negative, but an intensification of it. When there's something he dislikes, he simply has a compulsion to add extra negatives to describe it. It's like a Pavlovian dog or something. A little bell rings, he adds another negative. Reducing their number can thus help to unclutter his style without doing undue violence to his content. In my translation of Über das Dirigieren, for example, I reduced instances of the word not, nicht, to about a quarter compared to the original German, just to make the thing a bit more comprehensible. In order to give greater scholarly veneer to his arguments, Wagner also draws on the work of famous writers. In his essay Beethoven, for example, he openly appropriates Schopenhauer's vocabulary for discussing different types of dreams. And in Über das Dirigieren, he adopts Friedrich Schiller's terminology for naive and sentimental literature, applying it instead to what we describe today as classical and romantic music. Wagner also went one step further and started to create his own pseudo-scholarly vocabulary about music. He had already made tentative steps in this direction in the theoretical writings of his Zurich period, though it becomes more pronounced in Über das Dirigieren. And it's noteworthy that he only explains his practices in the 1872 preface to the third volume of his collected writings, where he says, "At the time, I was vividly inspired by reading several texts by Ludwig Feuerbach, prompting me to appropriate different designations for concepts that I then applied to artistic ideas, though they were not always able to correspond to them clearly." In fact, Wagner had probably felt encouraged in this by Feuerbach's own example, who compared his own approach to that of the sciences. In the preface to his Essence of Christianity, Feuerbach had written that the method that the present writer pursues here is one that is thoroughly objective, the method of analytical chemistry. The italics here are original. So Wagner now seems to have begun trawling through the scholarly and scientific literature in order to create his own aesthetic vocabulary. One word in particular becomes of central importance to his views on conducting: melos. Wagner's approach to conducting focuses on two basic concepts, both of them related: recognizing the melodic content or thematic content of a work, and playing it at the right tempo, with the latter dependent on the former. The key factor, says Wagner, is to perform a work as if you were singing it. Thus he wrote as follows about his epiphany upon hearing Habeneck conduct Beethoven's Ninth in Paris in about 1840. His marvelous orchestra sang this symphony, he wrote. Wagner's emphasis on uniting the symphonic with the sung was naturally an integral aspect of his own music dramas. We should recall here that Wagner's own musical frame of reference was vocal. He'd never learned to play any instrument properly, but he apparently had a decent singing voice, and right from the start of his career as chorus master in Würzburg, his work involved working with singers and learning to accompany them in the opera, which means breathing with them and accommodating their physical needs and their eccentricities of the moment. From our perspective, it hardly seems worthy of an epiphany to draw parallels between the instrumental lines of a classical or romantic symphony and the natural act of inhaling and exhaling that is the corporeal characteristic of performing music with and through the body. But many great post-Wagner conductors referred specifically to these passages in Über das Dirigieren, which suggests that making a link between instrumental music and vocality was not so blindingly obvious at the time. But how could he describe this vocal aspect so it sounds like a great insight? For that, you really need a good foreign word. Wagner probably came across the word melos first in one of the books about ancient Greek music and literature that were published in the early 19th century, or perhaps he found it when perusing Gottfried Schilling's Music Encyclopedia. The fourth volume of this, published in 1841, gives a three-line entry for melos, stating that it is Greek for Gesang, Lied, auch Gesangspoesie, singing, song, sung poetry, and that the adjective derived from it, mehlig, is used in German to mean melodic. In his artwork of the Future of 1849, Wagner decided to use melos to describe the emergence from folk song of Haydn's melodic style in the slow movements of his symphonies. That's here, we have the word melos. His next use of the word is in the third book of Opera and Drama, again to describe the emergence of instrumental music out of folk song. I'm not giving the English here because the actual content of the passage isn't important. It's just about the mention of the word melos. To the best of my knowledge, this word only occurs these two times in all his writings before Über das Dirigieren. But there's actually no reason for Wagner to use it at all. He simply means melody. Then in Über das Dirigieren, he uses it to mean melody or melodic content in Beethoven's orchestral works. Only by properly recognizing the melos can one achieve the correct tempo, he writes, and he writes about the new Beethovenian melos. Wagner had a smattering of ancient Greek, but it seems he never really mastered the language, and as an adult he read the greater tragedies always in German translation. He presumably used the word melos primarily because it sounds both broader in scope and more scholarly than just melody or tune. A foreign word often sounds clever, especially in a language hardly anyone speaks. The impact of melos proved immense. For after Über das Dirigieren, it entered into general use whenever people wrote about melodic content in the context of conducting orchestral music, usually with a reference to Wagner's practices. Being a Greek word, it also sounds just as clever in French and English. The early Wagner translators all kept it, Emile Guillaume in French and Edward Dannreuther and Ashton Ellis in English. Dannreuther actually adds a footnote that it means melody in all its aspects. Well, duh, what else was it going to be? But it's proven just as popular with later conductors and commentators, regardless of their native tongue. From Bruno Walter to John Barbadolli, they all use the word melos. It seems everyone finds it cooler to say a conductor has to draw out the melos, rather than just saying he lets us hear the tune. The word became inescapably associated with Wagner's art of conducting, as we can see it from the entry for melos in the 1967 edition of Riemann's dictionary. Earlier editions gave only the Greek context of the word, but here specific reference is made to its Wagnerian connotation. One of the commentators after Wagner who made much use of the word was Heinrich Schenker in his monograph on Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which, as Nicholas Cook once wrote, is a book haunted by Wagner. Given Wagner's superficial antipathy to much that was Italianate in music, one thinks naturally of Hans Sachs's disparagement of Welche Tant, Latinate frippery, in Die Meistersinger. It's wonderfully ironic that none other than Schenker accused Wagner of misunderstanding Beethoven's art of melody, treating his works instead just like any superficial Italian opera conductor would, who was devoted to nothing but tunes. But as Cook has pointed out, Wagner's discussion of the existence of a background melodic structure in a Beethoven symphony clearly seems to point towards Schenker's notion of the Urlinie, even though, or precisely because, Schenker felt that Wagner had himself misunderstood Beethoven's melos. So while Schenker coins his own term for the underlying melody in a Beethoven movement, we are faced with the peculiar fact that Wagner's terminology, invented, I believe, merely so Wagner could sound clever, leads more or less directly to a further generation of terminology that has in turn had an equally profound impact on music scholarship. This insistence on bringing out the melodic line in a work became an obsession of later conductors too, who consciously followed Wagner's example and didn't hesitate to change the score, not even when it came to Mozart. In the last movement of the Jupiter Symphony, for example, Fritz Reiner felt that the five-part invertible counterpoint here was obscured by the fanfares in the brass. You can see the fanfares there. So he added the timpani to the main theme. So the timpanist has to have either four timpani or he has to tune his timpani very quickly. It's very odd indeed. And while I can't prove it, I'm pretty sure that this obsession with bringing out the melodic line was filtered through Mahler to the Schönberg school, who started telling us which part was the main melodic line by assigning signs for main voice, Hauptstimme, and secondary voice, Nebenstimme, to their scores, like here in Berg's lyric suite. This, in my opinion, is a direct consequence of Wagner's art of conducting, in which the thematic line, the melos, was paramount. Melos might have been the most influential term that Wagner invented, but it wasn't his only appropriation from elsewhere. After melody, as I mentioned already, the second fundamental concept that occupies Wagner in Über das Dirigieren is tempo. More specifically, modifying it as the music requires, once one has recognized the vocal nature of its melodic lines. As contemporary reviews confirm, it was Wagner's tempo modifications in Beethoven and Mozart that seem to have struck people everywhere, from London to Vienna and beyond. Rubato in itself was nothing new. The word itself was in common currency among German musicians of the 18th and 19th centuries, and we already find numerous aspects of Wagner's later rubato practices listed in the theoretical literature in the first half of the 19th century. But his tempo changes must have deviated considerably from what was considered the norm, as otherwise they would not have been remarked upon independently by so many people. For example, it had been customary since the earlier part of the 19th century to slow down for the second subject in a sonata movement. Beethoven's sometime secretary Anton Seidl specifically mentions this in his writings. The fact that Seidl was unreliable shouldn't concern us here. Wagner and others regarded him as authoritative. But it seems that this is something that Wagner practiced to an extreme degree. When he conducted in London in 1855, one critic, Henry Smart, complained that he reduces the speed of an allegro, say in an overture or the first movement, fully 1/3 on the entrance of its cantabile phrases, by which he means presumably the second subject. Hanslick complained about this habit of Wagner's when he conducted the Eroica in Vienna 17 years later, in 1872. Hanslick wrote, Wagner seems to us to go too far with his modifications, such as when he begins the first movement very quickly, but promptly takes the second motive noticeably slower. In his essay on conducting, Wagner quotes the B-flat major motive from the first movement of the Eroica as a theme that ought to be played at a slower tempo. We obviously haven't got a recording of Wagner, but the Dutch conductor Willem Mengelberg, whom I'll mention in more detail later, performed this movement pretty much as Wagner seems to suggest one should. So let's hear this passage now. I'll start it a few seconds before the theme so you can hear how the tempo shifts. I hope you can hear this all right. It worked before. Sorry, I haven't figured out how to get the volume to stay there, to turn it down. Never mind. You've heard it. It's quite extreme, as you can hear. Wagner never uses the phrase tempo rubato in his writings, as far as I've been able to determine. When he comes to write about rubato in Über das Dirigieren, Wagner uses two terms. Sorry, beg your pardon. The first is Modifikation des Tempos or des Zeitmaßes. Wagner's second term for this is Zartlebigkeit. Here's the context in which it appears. Hierzu gehört vor allen Dingen, dass das Zeitmaß von nicht mindere Zartlebigkeit sei als das thematische Gewebe. Above all, the tempo should be no less flexible than the thematic web. There's no way of translating Zartlebigkeit directly into English. It means more or less possessed of fleeting life. Volatile or ephemeral comes perhaps closest, though these have connotations today that wouldn't suit Wagner's context, I feel. It seems that Wagner has here created a noun from the adjective zartlebig, which is also extremely rare, though I've found it in the scientific literature of the time, such as in Maximilian Perti's 1852 tract about microscopic organisms, published in Bern, where Wagner was living in Switzerland at the time, of course. Here it denotes the fragility and brief lifespan of these tiny creatures, which apparently die rapidly when observed in a drop of water. Not unlike the case of melos, there's no reason for Wagner to use this word except to sound clever, but it never caught on. Short, foreign words are much better for that. Just why Wagner decided to resort to scientific vocabulary to describe musical processes is in itself worthy of consideration. Adopting Schiller's vocabulary regarding the naive and the sentimental was hardly surprising, for these had become accepted aesthetic categories by Wagner's day. But aesthetics will always remain a matter of debate, whereas by the time Wagner was writing about conducting, science was already assuming its modern role as the sole bearer of truth and fact, and banishing falsehood in the process. Since Wagner was determined to have his interpretive practices recognized as possessing soul validity, hence all those passages in Über das Dirigieren when he criticizes the interpretations of Mendelssohn, Hiller, Reisiger, Lachen, and almost everyone else, turning to the vocabulary of science was perhaps a means by which Wagner could objectify his own art and thereby exert yet more control over the discourse about it. We know that Wagner was reading scientific literature in these years, not least because he mentions it occasionally himself. He possessed German and French editions of books by Charles Darwin in his Bayreuth library, and he himself names Darwin in his late essay Publikum und Popularität of 1878. Cosima's diary first mentions Wagner reading Darwin on June the 29th, 1872. But I believe that Wagner had dipped into The Origin of Species long before this. Wagner's essay on conducting insists repeatedly that tempo transitions must be unmerklich, imperceptible. Here are two typical examples. A modification of the tempo is deemed necessary. This tempo slows down imperceptibly and thereby reaches the somewhat more moderate tempo. In the next example, no longer are diverse variations simply strung together alongside each other. No, they touch each other directly and move imperceptibly one into the other. This word unmerklich occurs only 10 times in Wagner's writings in the 30 years before Über das Dirigieren. So on average, once every 3 years he'd use the word. But it comes 7 times alone in this essay, each time referring to transitions of some form or other. I suspect that this is an idea that Wagner either got from Darwin or at the very least found confirmed there. In the second chapter of the first German translation of Darwin's Origin of Species, made in 1860, differences among subspecies etc. are mentioned thus. Diese Verschiedenheiten greifen in einer Reihe geordnet unmerklich ineinander. And he goes on to talk about an Übergang, so imperceptible and transition. But Darwin's original passage reads very differently. There's no mention of any imperceptible transition, no unmerklicher Übergang. Instead, Darwin writes, these differences blend into each other in an insensible series, and a series impresses the mind with the idea of an actual passage. Similarities in vocabulary between Darwin in German translation and Wagner's essay on conducting don't provide concrete proof of influence, but even if there were no direct connection here, and I believe there is, such passages suggest a remarkable convergence in vocabulary in contemporaneous developments in both music and science. Just as Darwin wrote of an evolutionary, gradual, organic progression in the world, Wagner upholds an aesthetic of music as organic growth that would become central to Austro-German musical thinking over the ensuing decades, and that arguably found a final late flowering in the work of Wilhelm Furtwängler. There's an important point that we need to understand here. Most of Wagner's writings on conducting are about how to conduct Beethoven. With few exceptions, they're not about how to conduct his own music. Why? After all, he was quite possibly the most self-centered man in the history of Western music. The answer is simple. Whenever Wagner is writing about Beethoven, he's really writing about Wagner. In the mid-19th century, the only composer whose music was a firm fixture in the orchestral repertoire everywhere in Western Europe and in America was Beethoven. It wasn't Mozart or Haydn. Their symphonies were performed remarkably rarely, but everyone performed Beethoven. I believe that Wagner thought, okay, I'm getting too old now to travel the world conducting my music and passing on my ideas about how to conduct it. But if I can get people to perform Beethoven the way I want them to perform my music, once they do come to conduct my music dramas, they'll have already internalized my ideas on performance and they'll perform it the way I want. That's what I think he figured out. It's also significant that he actively encouraged the young men who worked for him as copyists and assistants in Bayreuth to go out into the world and apply for conducting jobs. In fact, by the end of the 19th century, the most important conducting posts in Germany, Austria, the USA, and Britain were held by men who had either copied Wagner's scores for him, had played for him, or had worked closely with his only ever conducting student, Hans von Bülow. So we're looking here at Gustav Mahler, Strauss, Damrosch, all protégés of Bülow in one way or another. And Wagner's copyists and assistants in Bayreuth and Triebschen were Anton Seidl, Hans Richter, Felix Mottl, Hermann Sumper. And Arthur Nikisch played under Wagner in Vienna and in Bayreuth in performances of Beethoven symphonies. And we all know how important Nikisch later was. All these men regarded Wagner's art of conducting as supreme, and they all tried to realize what he had told them and had written in his conducting essays. Only in one instance have I managed to find a score of a major classical work with annotations describing how Wagner conducted it, but it wasn't annotated by him. It was annotated by a chap called Adolf Wallnerfer, a young singer and a chorus for his performance of Beethoven's Ninth in Bayreuth in 1872. Wallnerfer took a score along and wrote in it where Wagner wanted a crescendo, a diminuendo, or tempo shifts. This score has been held by the Bayreuth Library since the 1930s, but it had been improperly catalogued, which is why I was the first person to discover it in the course of my researches for this book. Wagner's sometime assistant Heinrich Porges wrote a long essay about this particular performance of the Ninth Symphony, but in several details he recorded something different from Wallnerfer. For all kinds of reasons, I won't go into the details here. I believe Wallnerfer to have been the more reliable witness, not least because he'll have been sitting in the chorus facing Wagner, whereas Porges was sitting farther back in the hall and probably couldn't hear him properly. Here, for example, we have an example from Borges's essay on Wagner conducting the Ninth, where he says Wagner did a rit here and a tempo in the next bar. This is from the first movement, bar 94 onwards. Whereas in his score, Wagner wrote, yes, rit, but then a tempo only two bars later. Wallnerfer offers us something very interesting in the last movement. Here he gives us a detailed snapshot of the crescendi, diminuendi, and tempo shifts in the double bass solo as Wagner wanted it. So we have crescendo, diminuendo, crescendo, and then ritardando here. And then on the next page, he actually crosses out the quarter note on the third beat and puts it on the fourth, which Wagner obviously did when he performed this work, but this is mentioned in no other source for the work. And here we have a stringendo, so Wagner wanted the basses to get a lot faster there. Of course, all these documents, the essays, the contemporary reviews, this score, are all, to a greater or lesser extent, dry sources that have limited use. But what they do make evident is that Wagner's art of conducting, as he claimed of his art of composing, was an art of transition. When he conducted Mozart, Beethoven, and clearly his own works too, he replaced rigid shifts between forte and piano, slow and fast, with crescendi, diminuendi, accelerandi, and ritenuti. And this is something that we also find in the work of several conductors who regarded themselves as the heirs to his art of conducting, most notably Wilhelm Furtwängler and Wilhelm Mengelberg. Now, you've had to listen to my voice a lot, so I'll end with some music clips. As I mentioned, Wagner's ideas were put into practice by numerous later conductors who saw themselves quite clearly as working in the tradition that he had tried to establish. There's a passage in the scherzo of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony that all conductors find problematic because Beethoven puts the theme in the woodwind, accompanied by fortissimo octaves in the strings that inevitably tend to obscure it. To solve this balance problem, Wagner proposed, as I mentioned earlier, adding the four horns to the melody. And this was practiced by almost everyone afterwards, including Richard Strauss. Here you can see his annotations in his own score of the Ninth. Strauss actually goes four better. He adds 8 horns to play the melody. And even Toscanini did it, though with 4 horns, not 8. Toscanini is often regarded as someone who upheld the text above all. That's absolute rubbish. If you look at Toscanini's score and in your public library, you'll see that he copied Wagner's changes to the Ninth into his own score. Toscanini was no less averse to changing the text when he felt it necessary. So let's listen. You'll hear and see the horns playing the melody. So it's this we're going to be hearing, and here's the clip. And so on. Sorry, I don't know why it does that. There were also instances where Wagner seems to have completely misunderstood something, but people afterwards copied him anyway. There's a sign on the climactic chord towards the end of Weber's Freischütz overture, here, that people before Wagner assumed was an accent, and that's the general opinion today. But Wagner was convinced it was a diminuendo. Strauss thought that was actually a pretty bad idea. He didn't believe it. But most others did it to some degree or other, including Nikisch, Furtwängler, and Weingartner. And I've got a little clip of Weingartner doing it. It's not as pronounced as in some other conductors, but you can still hear that he does a diminuendo on this chord in particular. Let's listen to it. So that's that. We can quite clearly hear this diminuendo on the chord that today everyone plays with an accent. If you want to hear how I personally suspect Wagner's interpretations of the classics might have sounded, I think the best option is to listen to the recordings of Wilhelm Mengelberg. They're almost all available online, and they're also now coming out in very sort of cleaned up versions on CD, and they're fantastic. I've got the first CD. It's got some Mahler and Strauss on it, and the sound quality is really fantastic. Of course, Mengelberg never heard Wagner conduct, but Mengelberg was very close to Gustav Mahler, who had heard Wagner conduct, and Mahler, of course, had been mentored by Hans von Bülow, and Mahler, as we also saw in his handbill about the Ninth, Mahler was very conscious about working in Wagner's footsteps. Mengelberg practiced the same kind of rubato that Wagner writes about in his essays on conducting. Sadly, we've got no recordings of Mengelberg with modern post-war technology. He was banned from conducting after the Second World War because of his support for the Nazis in Holland. Mengelberg was a very strange man indeed, and highly complex. He wasn't, some of his views were really pretty obscene. The only newspaper he read was the Nazi newspaper, the Völkische Beobachter. For an intelligent man, Mengelberg was obviously extremely stupid, but he also could never understand why the Nazis wouldn't let him perform Mahler, and he just kept wanting to perform Mahler because he knew that Mahler was the finest symphonist of the early 20th century, and so why on earth shouldn't one perform him? So it's very sort of complex, Mengelberg's attitude toward Nazis and Nazi aesthetics. It's incredibly self-contradictory. Just when the ban on his conducting career ended, of course, he died. But his recordings were the biggest revelation I experienced when researching for my edition of Wagner's writings. And I really recommend to you all to listen to them. His Eroica, we heard a little clip from his Eroica earlier. It's quite astonishing, the amount of rubato he does. It sounds often as if he's actually improvising the symphony out of nothing. And yet the orchestra obviously knew him so well, and he was obviously quite an authoritarian, that there's also a sense of absolute control over the orchestra, even when it sounds at its absolute freest. It's quite astonishing. So I'd like to end today with just maybe a couple of minutes, the first couple of minutes of his Meistersinger Overture. I haven't got his annotated score. Sadly, I believe his scores will be put online in the near future. But all the, where are we? Sorry. All his, oh, there it is. All his recordings are online here. I can put the address in the chat later if you wish. You go into his music, and let's listen to just the first couple of minutes of the Meistersinger Overture. You'll hear quite clearly how he pulls the tempo around, just as Wagner suggests in his essay on conducting. And I will show you just a normal score of it so you can follow it at the same time. So let's listen to this now. I'm sorry we haven't got time for more. I'd rather listen to the whole thing. But that's the end for today. And thank you for your attention. And I look forward to having your questions. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it a lot. I've got one question out here from Robin McDuff over in soggy Santa Cruz, I presume, or maybe she's in Hawaii. She says, I have read that Wagner was the first composer to completely turn his back on the audience, that before him, conductors tended to turn to the side. Does this have any truth?
I don't think so. It's the position of the conductor was not really fixed until the middle of the 19th century. That is quite true. When Wagner writes about how Spontini conducted. It's fascinating how Spontini has sort of the orchestra around him rather than anything else. But Wagner obviously fitted in with the customs of the day whenever he was performing in the theater as a younger man. He didn't simply turn things upside down. What he did do, and here he seems to have been pretty much the first person to do it, and that's maybe what Robin's thinking of. Wagner seems to have been the first person to conduct Beethoven's Ninth or any work of that kind with the orchestra in front of him and the choir behind the orchestra on tiered seating. He did that in Dresden, and that was Wagner's sort of own design for how he wanted to perform the work. And Wagner's very concerned about finding the best sort of kind of seating arrangement for the acoustic that he wanted. So he wasn't the first to turn his back on the audience, as far as I know, but he did very much change the position of the conductor in several ways.
Great, great. Robin, by the way, is in Hawaii, and so is John Chilcott. Aloha, John. He asks, thank you for your excellent insights comment. What is Wagner's influence in the conducting of French and Russian music?
That's difficult to say. It's quite clear that Wagner's ideas of rubato had a huge impact in England, America, Germany, and Austria. I've not come across any specific examples of conductors conducting in this way in France. I confess it's not something that I've done a lot of research into. Wagner's writings were translated into French, and in fact, Giuseppe Verdi complained in an interview in the 1890s that the younger Italian conductors were starting to do rubato after the Wagnerian manner, and he didn't like it at all. So there was obviously an influence outside of Germany into the more Latin countries, but as far as I'm aware, no, there wasn't a big impact. And as for Russia, I mean, Wagner conducted in Russia, of course, and it seems he made quite an impression. But to the best of my knowledge, his writings weren't translated into Russian. And he didn't conduct enough in Russia in order to have any big impact as a conductor as opposed to a composer. I see that Deb Marion asked if Wagner was heavily influenced by Greek literature. Yes, a lot, but more as a composer and in his texts, of course, than in his conducting in any way. Though it's odd that it's interesting when it comes to Wagnerian vocabulary that we often use the word Gesamtkunstwerk as Wagner's recreation of the Greek idea of bringing all the arts together, whereas in fact Wagner almost never used the word Gesamtkunstwerk. That's a later habit among scholars. He always talked of the Vereinigtes Kunstwerk, the united artwork. I've not come across, Bradford, thanks for your question. I've not come across any comments by Wagner on where he wanted the violins. I believe it was customary to have the first and the seconds on each side of the stage in general back then. I don't think that he changed that, but and I've read everything I could find, I can assure you, and I've not come across anything that suggests that he had a fixed idea about that. He just took the violins wherever they were when he turned up somewhere to conduct.
We've got one from Deborah Marion. Wagner was Wagner heavily influenced by Greek literature?
Yeah, so I just said only as a composer, really, not as a conductor.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And then the second violins. Karen Gabrielson has two questions. Can you give me more detail on the conducting styles of Wagner versus Berlioz? And also, she asked, did Wagner know John Fields?
As far as I'm aware, Wagner never met John Field, no. As for Wagner versus Berlioz, the best comparison we have is the critics in London in 1855, where they criticized Wagner for doing lots of rubato and implied that Berlioz didn't do that. Sadly, I've not come across anyone who sat down, went to Wagner concert, went to a Berlioz concert, and sat down and made a list of the differences between them. I wish someone had. It seems no one did. But as I say, when the critics criticize Wagner, it's pretty clear that it's because they all prefer Berlioz. There were also personal things involved. Mendelssohn was very popular in England, and it had become known through an article in a New York journal that Wagner was the author of that ghastly essay, Jewishness in Music. And that was a talking point in London in 1855. And basically they thought, what is this stupid man writing about Mendelssohn, who was a great composer? And so they were badly disposed to him from the outset. And was Wagner's own fault, of course.
Okay. Michael and Sylvia O'Neill ask, would you say, did you answer the rubato question already?
No, I haven't.
Okay, thank you
to
for your
Michael and
excellent
Sylvia,
insights.
yeah.
Would you say Wagner's rubato is not currently used?
No, it's not. It's probably a bit too extreme for people to cope with today, though it's quite possible that in the course of historical performance practice, people will start to say quite rightly, but hang on, if we're going to perform Wagner as Wagner performed it, we've got to introduce all this rubato. As I say, I think the best examples of rubato are in Furtwängler and Mengelberg. If you listen to Furtwängler's recording of Tristan from the early 1950s, the way the tempo ebbs and flows is probably as close to Wagner as we're going to get. And of course, people like Thielemann see themselves very much in the Wagnerian tradition, but I can't think of anyone that dares to pull about the tempo quite as much as Wagner seems to have wanted today.
Interesting, interesting. I'm going to open up, Sylvia Lynn has her hand up. I'm going to go ahead and open up her microphone and allow her to talk. Sylvia, go ahead. Unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.
Hi, Sylvia.
Sylvia, are you there? No. Oh, okay. Well, if she has a question, I don't know what it is. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and lower her hand. All right. Any more questions? You were going to give us a discount code for the book for our.
Can I send it to you by email and you just forward it to everyone?
I will do that. That seems to be one of the easier ways to do it.
Yeah.
I kind of had to stop buying books because I haven't read all the ones I have.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yes, I have two lists, the books I haven't had time to read and the books that I haven't had time to finish.
Yeah.
So have we got any more questions out there? No, I don't see any. Oh, Emma, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question. It was a
Hi.
fascinating talk,
Thank you.
and I'd like to read the book. There's so much information there, and I love your insights into the use of language, the words that he used. It's just so interesting. As for conducting, so definitely you can say that Wagner created a school of conducting, and there were the followers of him which go into today, as you say, like Telemann. But at the same time, there are other conductors, there are ideas of conducting, there are interpretations, and so many different conductors today may create a different view, an important view of what this music is all about. How do we put together the Wagnerian view of his own music with a modern interpretation in conducting of it? And what is the importance of both?
I think that it's fascinating to figure out how Wagner wanted his works to be performed, because he was the composer after all, and it can tell us something about his works. And I get a particular thrill when I hear, say, Mengelberg conducting the Meistersinger Overture with these tempo changes. But my main opinion is Wagner's dead, we should do whatever we want. What's fascinating is that if you try and trace a kind of genealogy of conducting, things diverge pretty soon. So Otto Klemperer, for example, was also a protege of Mahler and was very much saw himself in the Mahlerian tradition. But he was in favor of a much more sort of objective style of conducting, whereas Mengelberg, who was the similar generation to Klemperer, also a Mahler protege, Mengelberg goes to the opposite extreme altogether. So they're both coming out of the same Austro-German tradition that goes back to Wagner, but the things they're doing is very different. But I think this is wonderful, and in a sense, I think Wagner would have wanted it. It's this idea again of being faithful to the text, but at the same time putting in your own interpretation and turning it into music. It's supposed to be alive. It's also this very organic way of looking at music. Wagner wanted a music that was alive and that touched you, and I get that as much from Klemperer as I do from Mengelberg, just in a very different way.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got a hand raised from Karen Gabrielson, and I'll go ahead and allow her to talk. Karen, if you want to open up your mic and ask a question, please do so. Can unmute yourself.
I didn't raise my hand, but I just wanted to say it's very informative talk. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to the book, and it will be on top of my read now pile.
That's very kind. Thank you. I hope you enjoy it.
I will.
Question.
Yeah.
Sorry, how long did it take for you to do all this research and the translation and write your essays?
It was part of a research project. I had a doctoral student as well working on Mozart's Jupiter and interpretations of it. The research project lasted for 4 years. It also involved a couple of conferences, and obviously it was a part-time thing. Translating the text took the most time because I rewrote everything about 3 times. It was so fiendishly difficult. I think the essay on conducting is just about the most complex prose that Wagner ever wrote. In the end, I mean, writing the book, my own part of it, it took, I was busy over a year with it, alongside everything else as well, of course. I mean, once I start to write, it usually goes quite quickly, but I originally intended to translate the essays and write a 5,000-word essay. In the end, I wrote about 40 or 45,000 words of essays, because I suddenly realized if I don't say this now, it'll be years before anyone else gets down to writing about this, and I just felt it had to be be done, and everything just needed so much context. But it was fascinating, and what I also do in the book, there are heavy annotations, so I bring examples, also music examples of what later conductors do, where they try and copy what Wagner suggests, so that I try through the footnotes to construct this kind of genealogy, even down to modern conductors who do certain things or have done certain things or written about these works in a certain way, so that we can see just what the impact of these essays were. They had a phenomenal impact. They really did, especially this one essay on conducting.
Thank you.
Really great. I don't have any more open questions out here. So I guess that ends the formal Q&A portion of it, but we have, Emma is going to put up some slides, or do you have another question?
I have another question.
Right.
It's again more of a discussion point and your opinion. Gideon Kramer a while ago recorded the Bach sonatas and partitas, and it was so vastly different from other recordings. And I listened and listened, and I realized he's doing something that is not in the text, so to speak. He recorded parts of it in a cathedral where the acoustics were totally different than in the recording studio, and of course he was very free with tempi and stuff like this, and he made a totally different piece of music out of so familiar sonatas and partitas. And I thought, of course he has a right as a creative artist to do it, but is he doing the right thing for Bach, so to speak? He takes Bach, which has its own architecture, it has its own sound and thought, and just builds a different building out of it, so to speak.
Yeah.
How do you feel about it? How would you feel about it?
I personally feel that the more varied interpretations a work can have, the more it says something about the quality of the work. If you have a bad piece of music, you won't be able to play it in 100 different ways because it'll just be bad. I've not listened to the recording by Kramer. I want to now, but I think Bach would probably have been delighted. In Bach's own day, there wasn't a single fixed way of performing things. Things were much more flexible, also for economic reasons. I mean, if Bach, if 10 of his singers had the flu one Sunday, his cantatas would have sounded very different, and he'd have coped. He'd have made changes. He'd have done something differently so that the end result still sounded good enough. So I think, well, composers often want to try and force performers into following one particular strand of interpretation. Composers know what they want. They think that we should know what they want as well. But in fact, once a composer has written a piece of music, it's up to us to deal with it. And if Gideon Kramer produces a result that sounds musical, that's engaging, it obviously is because it's interested you, it's fascinated you, then I think that's fantastic. And I know it's one of Wagner's most famous sayings, that Kinder schafft Neues. Children go and do new things. And that also has to mean we can do new things with his music as well.
Yes, thank you.
True.
Thank you.
Do you have a Facebook page or a website?
I've only got I've got a Facebook page, but it's nothing to do with music. It's usually just all my old ex-students who are now all having babies because they've reached that age. It's full of baby photos. I get very broody. I'm still waiting for the first grandchildren, you see. I don't really keep a web page. I have a pretty low profile, I'm afraid. I'm not very interesting. I'm on most of my writings are up online to be found as PDFs in my articles and things. And but apart from that, I don't really sort of put anything out there. I'm afraid I'm too boring.
Well, this certainly was not a boring
It
talk.
wasn't boring at all.
I remember some time back I read Alan Walker's book he had the 3 books on Franz Liszt, and
Liszt,
the book about Weimar, and all the correspondence going back and forth between Liszt and Wagner, because Wagner was in exile, and all these little notes and everything like that. That's a tremendous book to read if you want to get an insight into Wagner and Liszt, you know, who was giving birth to the wonderful Lohengrin. I mean,
yes,
and even the funny little asides about, well, you know, the butcher is playing this instrument, and you know, he couldn't be here today, so it was, you know, this, that, and the other thing, because you know, they didn't have standing orchestras back then, and they just had to catch as catch can, and sometimes a substitute had come in for somebody. So I would imagine the score markings had to be quite prodigious. Yeah.
I mean, sadly, as I said, you know, we don't have any of Wagner's scores at all. But you know, the thing is also, he rehearsed from memory. I mean, he rehearsed the whole of Beethoven's Ninths from memory. It's astonishing, but it's something that his students and assistants took on as well. Hans von Bülow also did everything from memory, and Hans Richter apparently also conducted everything from memory. He had all the Beethoven symphonies, Mozart symphonies, he had them all in his head, every single part. And he could also play all the instruments. Hans Richter would actually go over to the clarinetist and say, no, don't play it like this, you do it like that. Quite astonishing. I mean, I know nothing like it. Yeah.
It's hard to imagine. It's really hard to imagine. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to hand it over to Emma, because she has a couple slides to show about what's coming up for the Wagner Society after this fantastic talk. So our next talk will be, we're going to have a live meeting. And right now, I don't know, you know, with this crazy new virulent COVID strain that's going around right now, I don't know whether there'll be any precautions in place over at, oh, by the way, here's a little irony alert, Chris. We meet at the JCCSF, the Jewish Community Center in San Francisco. And they love us. We have Professor Claudia Stevens who's going to be with us, and she and her husband have just collaborated. They've written a new take on The Tempest, and she's going to talk about the price of power and compare and contrast Wotan and Prospero. And then I will send information out to all our Wagnerians if they want to go see the premiere of this work. It will be in the Wilsey Center at the Veterans Memorial Building right next door to the San Francisco Opera House. So that'll be in February. And I don't have the March and April meetings completely sorted out yet, but early announcements. In June, we're going to have with us the amazing Helden tenor, Clay Hilly, the wonderful artist who was working in San Francisco during The Ring and some other operas some years back, but he was a cover for the Helden roles. And so he never went on because nobody got sick. So here he spent all this time here in San Francisco, and he loves San Francisco. And he seemed to be the go-to fella if they had a sick Helden tenor. Well, now he's come into his own. We heard him, many of us were in Berlin 2 years ago when they did their new Ring cycle, and Clay Hilly was the Siegfried. So we'll have him on Zoom, and he is quite hilarious. It'll be a lot of fun talking with him. And then Catherine Sire will be with us in June to talk about the other Richard and talk about Die Frau und Schatten and the Wagnerian influences there. That'll be a live music meeting over at the JCCSF. And so we're all looking forward to Die Frau und Schatten. We haven't had it here, I'm thinking probably 20 years, 15 or 20 years since we've had it. So that's going to be a real treat for all of us here. We are having a party in May, but we don't have all the details sorted out. We're going to celebrate Richard's party over in Palo Alto, near where the West Bay Opera will be performing The Flying Dutchman. So that'll be all exciting. It will be a matinee performance, and we'll have a little get together afterwards. So that's what how we're celebrating Wagner's birthday. So those are all the announcements I have. I'll put them together in emails and send them out to everybody. And also I'll have that discount code for the book. So that's all I have for you folks. Thank you for being with us. And we're just going to go quiet while everybody logs out. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you.
Thanks for having me. It's been great fun.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.